Caesar's great distraction, the games. And I kind of live there, when the world is nuts, and isn't it always? And you feel like you just gotta get away. It's kind of nice to have an obsession. For many of us, though not for many of us astrologers, and many of us many of us probably, I should say predominantly American men, that obsession might just be football. And I'm one of those cats these days more than ever, which is kind of ridiculous. So I'm very interested, like if I had time, there's so many more things that I would be exploring astrologically and likely sharing that, because it's one of my favorite things to do, is like to teach as I learn, or to like I guess put my personal exploration and education through experience out there. You'd be seeing a lot more content from me, but I'm a really busy guy. We had a baby. She turned 15 weeks old yesterday. One thing I can't wait to share sometime is, what is a week? What is a month? Like when Maya turned 3 months old. According to what? Like 3 turns of the calendar pages, and then looking for the same number of a month in some weird Gregorian thing? That, Or does it have to do with the moon? And if so, how? Because there are many moons. Tale for another time. Anyway, I just want to start by saying I'm a little sad that I can't do all these projects that I want to do, and that's okay. It's very easy when I look into the eyes of my amazingly awesome daughter and my beloved and Koa, like, it's all good. And family's the temple right now, and it's a really beautiful temple, and I'm blessed. But if I had more time, like yesterday, I would have been really doing a deep dive investigation of astrology charts for Monday Night Football tonight. So yeah, I'm a football fan. I mean, I'll just say some of this may come from, that was and remains one of the easiest ways for my father and I to connect. As you can imagine, that's probably not that deep. I mean, in a kind of patriarchal culture, where men aren't necessarily advised to have a feeling body, and I'm not saying we shouldn't at all, but where that tends to be the training, whether conscious or not. Sports is one place where men get to laugh and cry together. And again, I don't mean to I don't mean to say this is only about men in any way, okay? But I'm going to speak about men. I'm going to speak about my experience in this regard. And for me, and maybe in my own birth chart, it looks at Mars, strongly aligned to the sun and doing things. I'm not so sure. But there has been an ability for my father and I to connect through sports. I mean, a lot of that times it makes me sad, because we'll have a phone call for the first time in a long time, and that's like the whole of the conversation. And we're not even really rooting for the same teams or the same sports necessarily. My dad loves college football. I love professional football. But it's something that we can talk about, and at least we're talking. Do you feel me? And in those times when you do share hopes and dreams with others who are rooting for the same team, on one level it can look many different ways astrologically, like from a personal and natal chart basis. One, it's like 4th house, right? It's like, it's your cult, it's your culture, it's your home. It's, grew up Seahawks fans. Right, so it's interesting for Koa, because he spends half his life with us and then half his life with his dad, which is a lot for a kid. And I don't want to have that conversation here, but just in regards to like his dad doesn't really love football, but when he does, he likes 49ers. That's the local team and they're really good. But at our house, it's about the Seahawks, y'all. It's about the Seattle Seahawks. I lived there 17 years. I grew up in a town, Las Vegas, Nevada, that at that time was not allowed to have professional football teams. And so I kind of took on Boston teams because I was born in Boston, but mostly because my dad grew up in Boston. That was his crew, you know. But then I started rooting against them just to like have some, you know, be an antagonist for my father, I guess. Whether consciously or not. These are the myths. These are the myths, right? And so like my sister's boy, Kyle, my nephew, Seahawks fan. You know, I was living with them at a very tender time of his life. And he actually, it was really kind of cracks my heart open. This is how amazingly interesting this thing can get. When he told me that I was the one that like gave him football. He was a football player. Sadly, injuries kept him out because he was great. He was just on TV at the University of Colorado Buffaloes game wearing some outlandish fan stuff. You know, and so it's a place where we get to bond, where we get to scream, where we get to talk smack together. Where we laugh and we cry, and it's a whole thing. And so as much as I kind of despise myself for falling prey to Caesar's great distraction, which is what the Colosseum games are intended to be, and you know, football, regardless of whether you use that word to describe what Americans call soccer or American football, like it's probably the closest thing to the Coliseum game these days, since, you know, especially American football, it's so gladiator. And so there's things that I despise about myself in that regard, being a football fan. Anyway, so let me get to the point, I guess. If I have more time, and maybe I'll find the time, I'm really interested in starting to investigate whether or not I can see wins and losses, potential errors using the great cosmic craft of astrology, hence the subject for this driving jam of the Celestial Colosseum. You know, I mean, if we weren't distracted by the games, then we could focus on real life, like politics. But see, once you realize that that's actually the greatest game there is, once you realize that politics is just the entertainment division of empire, it's just no longer that interesting. So why not go watch a game that actually, I don't know, I'd suggest is more sophisticated, like football. Call me wrong, that's your right to do. And so I'm kind of interestingly embracing my love for sports. It's not that healthy in my relationship, and that's often true for sports fans. But I don't think it's a terrible thing. Well, first of all, I mean, it's something I'd love to share. Like, I have friends who are couples who, like, love the same team, and it's a really nice thing to share. But it's also really imperative, as you know, in successful relationships to have different interests, right? The issue is that when one of the partner's interests is deemed ridiculous by the others, and I'm not saying Scorpiona does me like that, but I wouldn't blame her if she did. You know, if I spent the amount of time studying astrology that I do studying football, I'd be a better astrologer. I'd be better at my craft. But we can't only be on like one thing either, right? It's super important. Well, Nadine, I'm reading that you're a big fan of the NFL and Major League Baseball. That's awesome. It's fun to hear that too, right? It's just like something you don't necessarily expect in astrological crowds. You don't expect sports people to like astrology. You don't expect astrology people to like sports. I mean, for me, like my teachers, like Daniel Jamario, he's a sports fan. Gary Caton, sports fan. Adam Ellenboss, I saw last year, was starting to do some astrology and football. I'm actually reach out to him and see if he wants to do a thing together on it. And Adam recently returned to, I believe, his home state of Minnesota, where the Minnesota Vikings are playing amazing. So 'tis the season. Well, I'm a Seahawks fan, and the Seahawks are doing great, and we are going through this rebirth because after 14 years under a particular head coach and therefore culture, that was Pete Carroll, the Seahawks let him go last year and brought in Mike Macdonald. We went from the oldest coach in the league to the youngest coach in the league. And interestingly, from a 72-year-old coach at the time to a 36-year-old coach. And so that's interesting, of course, because 36 and 72, Mike Macdonald literally at that time of that transition, half the age of Pete Carroll. But if you know my work around eclipse cycles, Saros series, nodal return windows, like those are them. And so Mike Macdonald, the Seahawks' new coach, he has since turned 37. He's right in his second nodal return window. Recently announced that he's becoming a father, right? Like big life changes. That will be a very interesting thing to study. And the head coach's chart would be one interesting chart to gaze into when you're trying to analyze how well will a football team do today. Now we come to the significant issue of timed charts. And by the way, when I do finally find the time to create like some Seahawks astrology videos, and I probably will, probably tuck that away in some other playlist space. This will be where I begin. What chart do you use? Okay, so in a football team, there's the head coach. There's many other coaches beneath them in the hierarchy. There's two beneath the head coach that are the most important, maybe three, who are the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, and then the special teams coach. And then there's all sorts of coaches beneath them. And then what about players? I mean, it's basically accepted that the quarterback, if a professional football quarterback, is the most important position in any team sport. They just have more to do with the outcome of the game than any single position in any other team sport. Now, you could say when you look at specific basketball teams, for example, that maybe it's LeBron James, right? But that's not a position, that's a person. When you look at baseball, I mean, so much is going to have to do with the pitcher, but anyone who watches baseball knows if the pitcher's not doing well, you take him out. If you're a decent manager, right? And maybe you leave him in if you're a decent manager, which just reminds us how important the manager is in baseball. Right? Now, the issue is, like, let's say I wanted to look in the case of the Seattle Seahawks at the head coach's chart, that's Mike Macdonald. I don't know his birth time. Or if I want to look at the quarterback, that's Geno Smith, I don't know his birth time. Or if I want to look at specific charts of specific players for this game, on a professional football team, you have 53 players. And not all of them are going to be active for a game. So, I mean, this would have to be like AI astrology if we really wanted to get an analysis of like a particular moment, like the start of a football game, which is the moment we would choose if we were going to look at the game astrologically. If we wanted to do that for each of the players who would take the field that day, you're going to have to run about 100 charts. And like, I'm not going to do that. This is one of the things that actually kind of excites me about the potential of advanced computer analysis, right? Okay, so, you know, like I would look at maybe a few charts just for the sake of my own study and because I think it's good. But probably the chart that you want to look to is the chart for the team. Now, what about that? So the Seattle Seahawks were actually, in a way, born in 1975 when I was. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I love them. Yeah, I said love. That's when the NFL decided to expand, and they brought in two new teams who would become the Seattle Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, almost the teams who are most separated geographically from one another. Though Miami Dolphins are actually further from Seattle than Tampa Bay is, just barely. Now, the Seahawks became a franchise, but they weren't named. I mean, interestingly, not long after the city was awarded a team, thanks in great part, from my understanding, to the work of Mr. Nordstrom, yeah, like Nordstrom's, who did so much and paid so much money to get a team there. He shortly thereafter died of a heart attack. And that happened before the Seahawks ever played a game. I can't remember. It might have happened actually before they even had a name. So is it when they were named? Well, I would see that like when Seattle was granted a team, that would be much like, if we compare this to a birth, much like a conception. Or even a conception, like wanting to go for it. But that would be more like, let's decide to have a baby, right? In conception, and then like knowledge that the pregnancy took. That's like team, gets a team. And many people will have a name for their child even before they're born, as we know. But what is the birth of a football team? Probably the first game. And then the good news there is we actually have that chart for the Seahawks. I found out it's 4:00 p.m. on September 9th, maybe, 1976 in Seattle, Washington. And as I haven't spent much time with the chart yet, but I can see it. And then what I would do is I would take that chart. I would do some other things. I would look at the synastry between that chart and charts of very important Seahawks and Seahawks coaches. I would also look at that chart and perspective of significant transit charts like the Super Bowls in 2005 and in 2014 that the Seahawks lost, and the Super Bowl in 2013 that the Seahawks won. What's up? And just see if it kind of makes sense. I would look at the solar return chart for that year and use some other timing techniques and see if this suggests like a big winning year. And so there would be some energy there, right? Here's the issue with me if I chose to use first game chart to be the principal chart of my astrological analysis for a football team. Well, expansion teams are rare. Like when the league began, there were many teams. I'm sorry to say I'm ignorant. I can't tell you exactly how many. But like when a team plays its first game, it's playing against another team. So unless it's this rare case of an expansion team, that would suggest that two different teams have the exact same chart. Now, I mean, interestingly, and this kind of touches into relocational astrology, let's say, for example, and I'm not saying this is true, I have no idea. Let's say that the New England Patriots played their first ever game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, so they would have that same birth moment, and it would be either in Pittsburgh or in New England. But we could cast one of the charts for Pittsburgh and one of the charts for New England, right? Okay. Anyway, I want to honor, like Nadine said, well, what about the GM? That's interesting for sure. Probably especially around draft time and trade deadline time. And some GMs have a lot more input than others do. Yeah. So, I mean, basically, you have all of these charts you need to work with. We could do some synastry charts. Like, what about head coach and quarterback? I mean, you just get into a pretty tricky space, but it's kind of like, how is this event going to affect a family? How is this event going to affect a country? So let me end kind of where I didn't begin, but touched into a little bit. So consider like a presidential election in the United States. If you were doing this by a team-based analysis, sadly, in this bipartisan duality division approach to domination and control, we could maybe try to find a birth chart for the Republican Party and a birth chart for the Democrat Party. Because all your independents in your Green Party and all that, it doesn't have a chance. That's not within the scope of a two-party front. And maybe we just want to look at the one birth chart for the United States, which is really intriguing because most people use for the states the Declaration of Independence versus the moment of independence, which is what we use for most other countries. So that's an intriguing thing. In the case of a presidential competition, election, selection, I mean, at least you have two birth charts. And then, of course, getting timed birth charts can be a great ordeal. Like, people wonder about the true birth time of Kamala Harris or of Donald Trump, for example. I mean, you might want to also consider the birth charts of the vice presidents that are running with them. You might look at the birth charts of whoever's backing them. But let's just say it's as easy as you have this birth chart for Trump and this birth chart for Harris, and which one's going to do better. That's how most people are choosing winners of presidential elections. What I want to say is this, just to end on the other significant problem of me doing football, using astrology to, like, let's say if I wanted to predict football outcomes. I should only do that for teams other than the Seahawks. And other teams were like, I don't have skin in the game, if I don't care. I have never seen an astrologer start their who's going to win the presidential election with, I must say, I would greatly prefer this candidate to win, but the astrology suggests, I'm sorry to say, the other one will. I have never once seen it. I have only ever seen, this is why the person showing up in a blue pantsuit, Kamala Harris, will win. Or this is why this person showing up in his red devil suit, why Donald Trump will win. I have never, ever, ever, ever seen, and if you have, please show it to me. I've never seen somebody drinking the Coke, that means a Republican, saying that Pepsi's going to win the presidential election. And I have never seen somebody drinking the Pepsi, that means a Democrat, saying that Coca-Cola is going to win the election. I have never once seen it. I have seen a lot of astrologers tell me who's going to win the presidential election. And like, let's say like, you know, the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump election 8 years ago. It was like, oh, we are the great astrologers because we got Donald Trump right. It's like, no, you're the few Republicans who practice astrology and show up at conferences. Because everybody else said Hillary Clinton. Why? Because they're drinking the Pepsi. Do you know what I mean? And it's something I really fear about astrology is we kind of make it do what we want it to do. And that's not science. And by the way, astrology is not the only science, yeah, I said it, that works that way. People manipulate their experiments all the time to create the results they want to see. It's just a danger of science. It's not necessarily part of the scientific method. It is part of the, the observers or experimenters' conscious or probably even more so unconscious participation that we see showing up in things like quantum physics models, isn't it? It's all entanglement. But when you're so entangled, right, like I want to see somebody do astrology of a presidential election who doesn't care. And that's not me. I want to see somebody do the astrology of a sporting event that doesn't care. And frankly, most sporting events, that is me. But when the Seahawks take the field, that is certainly not me. And so come 5:15 p.m. tonight, you know where I'm going to be. Let's go Hawks.